I am Rebecca Tom-Ford-Hauser from the Center for Justice Innovation, formerly the Center for Court Innovation. We're so excited to welcome you to this two-day conference, Transforming the Work, Transforming Ourselves. My hope is that we can create space over the next 2 days that allows the learning and sharing that lead to transformation. We are thankful to the Office on Violence Against Women for their support of this project and the conference, and note that the opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed over the next 2 days are those of the faculty and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. And I think we have that disclaimer on the next slide. I welcome you from the state of Vermont, the unceded land and current home of the Abenaki people, who have cared for this land for generations and continue to do so. Abenaki means people of the Dawn Land. In honoring the land in which I live, I honor the earth that is now covered in snow, but awaits both the dawn and the warmth of the sun that will soon melt this snow and bring forth the first buds of spring. Today, as we're thinking about transformation, I encourage us all to soften like the soil will and allow the buds of transformation to begin to grow in us. In honoring the land that I am on, I am acknowledging the pain and violence that capitalism, colonialism, and industrialization have inflicted on the Abenaki people, our environment, non-human beings, and on humanity itself. I am grateful to share on this land, to live and breathe on this land, to grow my family on this land, and learn from its elders, both past and present. As I mentioned, the Center for Justice Innovation recently changed its name to align more with its work and its values. The Center for Justice Innovation, based in New York City, works to achieve justice and equity, create healthy, safe, and thriving communities, and ultimately transform justice system. The center does this by integrating new thinking and creative practices, rigorous research and data analytics, and implementation assistance and policy guidance. Rest assured, we're all working to change our name from expert assistance to something else, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Our core values affirm our commitments to operational excellence and continuously learning and growing from past efforts. We strive to embody 4 values in all of our actions: internal and external, local and national, community-based, and system-focused. The center's core values are integrity, impact, equity, and collaboration. Brittany Davis, Jess Resnick, Jean Johnson, who all helped put this amazing conference together, and I are part of the Office of National Initiatives, providing support to jurisdictions seeking to enhance their work with people who cause harm through intimate partner violence. We work collaboratively with other teams in the Office of National Initiatives to complement our work, including our tribal justice, community justice, and recovery and reform teams. Our team is the Gender and Family Justice team. We are situated within the Office of National Initiatives, and we are a diverse group of attorneys, advocates, social workers, group facilitators, policymakers, and practitioners. Again, a special thanks to Brittany, Jess, and Jean, who worked so hard to put our amazing conference together. In working with each other and in community, our team has created a set of values. You'll get to know that we love values and guiding principles in our work. Here's an example of our team's values statement. In all of our work, we really strive to be equitable, intentional, collaborative, centering well-being and self-reflection. We acknowledge that we work within systems that uphold institutions institutional inequity, and are committed to listening and amplifying the voices and perspectives of institutionally harmed communities in our work. We strive to be anti-racist and inclusive of marginalized individuals. The project that we've been working on over the past several years is the Abusive Partner Accountability, Engagement, Training, and Technical Assistance Project funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. Brittany, Jess, Jean, and I work on this project, and we work in community with others to help enhance abusive partner intervention programs across the country. As you can probably tell, we love guiding principles and values at the center. We find it helps us grounds us and allows for a collective launch pad from which we can work in community. What is our work together? We work with a diverse group of practitioners, and you can see them here. We're grateful for the partnership of Juan Carlos and Futures Without Violence and our valued consultants, many of whom run some of the leading programs across the country. Programs that are trauma-focused, culturally responsive, and anti-racist. We work with survivor advocates, and we have judicial representation as well. If you don't know the folks on this list and our partners, you'll get to meet many of them throughout the next 2 days. Together, we've created several publications, webinars, and an amazing podcast series that Juan Carlos is our MC of, and that podcast series focuses on each of our guiding principles. We've had the pleasure of going on site to work in community with folks and have hosted several virtual trainings such as this. When we first started this project, we got together pre-COVID and decided that we were going to do this work collectively and collaboratively through a set of guiding principles. Over the next 2 days, we'll be diving deeper into these guiding principles. These guiding principles really allowed us to figure out what it means to be doing this work individually with people who cause harm through intimate partner violence and collectively. In our work over the past few years, we've had several training and technical assistance questions that have come up, issues that we've worked in community to address, especially understanding what the trends and innovations are in this work. How can we address the lack of resources in either rural, urban, or suburban communities? How can we address the limited culturally specific options for those who cause harm through intimate partner violence, and what does it mean to intentionally engage around anti-racist work? Building up the training and capacity needs of abusive partner intervention programs facilitators. And then we've had the pleasure of working with several states and jurisdictions and helping them revise their standards for programming. So today we're focusing on transforming the work and transforming ourselves. We hope this is an inspiring 2 days where we can really grow and learn and bring back new practice for our work. A brief overview of what we're going to be doing today. I'm so excited for our first plenary, so I'm going to wrap up soon and turn it over to Jason, and then we can get started with the plenary, looking at intersectionality. We're going to have several workshops throughout the day, and you are welcome to join those workshops. You may have self-selected into one of them, but if you change your mind, just let us know and we can make sure you get to the right place. But we're going to be having workshops on self-reflection, the role of abusive partner intervention programs and coordinated community response, culturally responsive approaches to abusive partner intervention and engaging refugees and new Americans, and using self-disclosure in facilitation. And then we'll be wrapping up the day thinking beyond binaries, really moving towards an inclusive framework for supporting those who cause harm. As we're moving through these 2 days, we invite you to bring your minds and hearts. Transformation, I think, starts with humility, and I am going to be bringing that today and tomorrow as I learn from all these amazing folks. try and be present. I know it's hard for 2 days. We built in some breaks and some lunch breaks, so we know that you have a lot going on in your lives. We hope you can be present as you can through these. Be aware of what's going on in the groups and willing to learn from others, being real and authentic. These are really new, hard, and exciting heart conversations that we're going to be having today. So be curious, ask a lot of questions. We've got amazing faculty here over these next 2 days. Be brave and take some risks. Try something new, either over the next few days or bringing it back, or maybe you have a group tonight, you can practice something new. Be brave and take those risks. And you know, you might not always agree with what's being said. It might be something that is on your growing edge. So we encourage you to have those disagreements and those discussions. I know that a lot of those discussions happen in the chat. So let's try and be as respectful as we can with each other and with the faculty. We encourage questions. I am going to turn it over to Jason from the Office on Violence Against Women to welcome you on behalf of them.
Thank you, Rebecca. Welcome, everyone. I hope you are ready for a full and exciting couple of days. As Rebecca mentioned, my name is Jason Patry. I'm a grants management specialist with the Office on Violence Against Women, and have the privilege of working with the Center for Justice Innovation on a number of projects, including this training and technical assistance project on abusive partner intervention programs. OVW is committed to doing everything we can to address the needs of survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and to hold offenders accountable. We know that to hold offenders accountable, we need to do more than to supervise them in the community or to incarcerate them. But to be accountable means to move past old ways of thinking and create new and healthy ways to approach life's challenges. Abusive partner intervention programs are a proven strategy to address the needs of offenders and enhance the safety for survivors. Because of this, APIPs are an integral part of a holistic response to intimate partner violence. This is why OVW is pleased to support this conference and are committed to continue the work with the Center for Justice Innovation and others to advance abusive partner intervention programs. Before wrapping up, I want to take a quick moment to mention to you that the Office on Violence Against Women is actively publishing grant opportunities for the 2024 grant cycle. A few solicitations have opened and many more will be coming available in the next couple of months. So if you are interested, please visit our website at justice.gov/OVW. And I will put that in the chat. Thank you again, Rebecca, and I hope everyone has a wonderful couple of days.
Before we get started on our first plenary, we just wanted to go over a few tech considerations. So we are recording all of these sessions, so you'll have access to the recordings once the conference ends. Closed captioning and ASL interpretations are available, so make sure you have your captions enabled. At the end of each session and at the end of each day, there will be evaluations. So please remember to fill out those evaluations, especially if you are requesting a certificate from us for your attendance. For these webinars, there will be a Q&A box where you can ask questions specifically for the panelists only. If you have questions regarding tech or anything about the conference, please email us at that email, or you can use a lobby chat, or you can also message one of the moderators individually on the Zoom events page. If you click on each session as well, on the itinerary or on the landing page, you'll see speaker bios as well as the PowerPoints used in each session. And with that, I will pass it over to Juan Carlos Arean from Futures Without Violence to start our first plenary, the Prism of Intersectionality, Enhancing Abusive Partner Intervention Programming, through addressing difference.
Thank you so much, Jess, and good morning, everybody. I'm so excited to be part of this conference, to be moderating a couple of panels. I'm actually excited at every session. This is one of the few conferences, I have to say, where every session that I saw was like, wow, I want to go to that session. Unfortunately, some of them are concurrent, so I had to choose between two of them, but that's life. I think they will be recorded, so hopefully we'll be able to partake of the wisdom, the amazing presenters here. I still see Rebecca highlighted. I don't know if we want to switch to our panel. And I will introduce myself. My name is Juan Carlos Arean. I use pronouns he and él, and I'm a program director at Futures Without Violence, which is a partner in this grant with the Center of Justice Innovation. We are a national and international organization that does a lot of things, including public policy, training, technical assistance in various realms, as well as developing materials and so on. So our first panel is on intersectionality, and I don't remember an APIP conference in the past. I might be missing this, but I don't remember one that started with the topic of intersectionality. So I thank you for the organizers for setting us up this way. And thank you for the panelists for being here. So I will briefly introduce our amazing panelists. And I should say also that if people have questions, you can use the question and answer function that should be at the bottom of your screen. We might not get to all the questions, but we'll try to answer at least some of the general themes. My colleagues are curating some of the questions so that we know what are the things that you want to hear more about. So I have the great honor and pleasure to be today with Gretta Gardner, Esquire. She is the Chief Legal Officer and co-founder of Ujima, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community. Ms. Gardner's career as a legal advisor for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault was inspired by her early work as a prosecutor in the domestic violence unit of the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office. She has worked for over 3 decades to help shape guidelines, policies, and procedures that local, state, and federal policymakers and college and university campuses can use to end intimate partners violence and racial bias. She received her BA in psychology from Vassar College and her JD from the University of Maryland School of Law, and is licensed to practice in DC, Maryland, Texas, and the Supreme Court of the United States. She's also an expert witness and a certified mediator. Ms. Gardner belongs to a multitude of local, state, and national committees that address violence against women and their children. And I could go on and on, but you can Google our presenters because I really want to get into the conversation, or you can see the bios that are being shared. And then I'll move to wonderful Catherine Shugrue dos Santos, who is a transformational client services executive and social justice activist leading policy change, impactful program development, and strategic alliances to build community and mobilize equity for historically oppressed communities. Kat is the president and CEO of Shugrue dos Santos Consulting and currently serves as the executive director at Fresh Youth Initiatives, FYI, whose mission is to empower youth who have fewer resources to reach their greatest potential. Prior to bringing her talents to FYI, Kat served as the Deputy Executive Director for Programs at the New York City Anti-Violence Project, which envisions a world in which all lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and HIV-affected people are safe, respected, and live free of violence. Welcome, Kat. And last but not least, Vali Kalei Kanuha, who was born and raised in a rural town in Hawaii in the 1950s. Kalei is the daughter of a native Hawaiian father and Nisei, mother, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Dr. Kanuha considers herself a critical, indigenous, feminist, activist practitioner scholar with a focus on gender violence against women and children and the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender and sexual identity. For the past 50 years, Kalei has worked as a community-based researcher and consultant with organizations in Hawaii and the continental US, and lectures widely on violence against women and social justice issues. Dr. Kanuha's research and community interests include using indigenous, culturally based interventions for family and domestic violence, intimate violence in women's same-sex and queer relationships, and alternative community-based justice innovations to address interpersonal and state violence, including critiques of carceral systems, transformative and restorative justice, and abolition feminist. I could go on, and you can see that I'm not very good at reading. I'm better at talking. So it's good that I'm stopping there for now. So welcome everybody. You can see we have such amazing experience and wealth of knowledge here. I would briefly like to start by going back to the principles that Rebecca mentioned at the beginning, because this is really what guides not only this conference, but has been guiding our work for the last 6 years or so. And as Rebecca mentioned, is really the product of great minds that have come together to think about this. And I hope that most of you will feel like, oh, yeah, my program, my work does align with this vision, with these principles. And it's important to mention that principles are important because they are our guiding, our North Star, right? They guide us as the name says. So when we start going in a different direction, it's always good to go back and say, is this aligned with our principles? And by the way, if you go to our website and our clearinghouse, that's part of this project, and maybe the link can be shared, you will see a lot of resources connected to the principles, including assessments and other things like that. So I'll go quickly through them. Hopefully all the work that we do, this is a fundamental principle. Survivors have to be at the center, right? Of survivors' voices, survivors' lived experience has to be at the center. We cannot be working with people who cause harm without closely and ongoingly listening to survivors. And we will talk a lot about accountability and what does accountability mean. I know that there's probably 200 people here. There's 200 definitions of accountability. We do have a definition that I won't share today, but what I have to say is that in this project, we are moving away from punitive accountability and moving towards an accountability that's relational, that's personal, and it's also communal and systemic. Also at the center of the interventions, we hope that hope and the signs of hope that probably you will hear more about, and dignity are restored for people who cause harm and for everybody, really, the whole family. And that culture and community are reflected and valued. So we'll talk a little bit about this in this panel, and I'd be part of a workshop where we will go deeper in some of these concepts. And that the strategies that we use with people who cause harm are responsive to not only their risks and their danger and so on, which most of us centered on, but also to their needs and to their strengths to create a balance. It's not either or, it's both and, right? So these top principles were the first 5 that we developed for this program, and then we decided to add 2 more that we thought were important. So one is that racial justice is also centered. And I have to say, this is something that we don't often talk about in abusive partner intervention. So we will be talking about it in this panel and hopefully throughout the conference. And certainly there will be wonderful workshops and opportunities to talk about self-reflection and how it should be prioritized. So keep in mind, these are the guiding principles for this conference, for our project, and hopefully you can integrate some or all of them in your work. And now I would like to switch gears and start talking about the topic of this workshop, which is intersectionality. Some of you might have heard the term intersectionality. For some of you, it might be a new term. It was developed by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw 35 years ago. So it's been around for a while. It's a complex concept. It's interesting because we were, as a panel and with the help of Lee, looking at quotes that would capture in a sentence what intersectionality is. And we couldn't find something that totally encompasses what intersectionality is. Fortunately, I have our wonderful panelists that will talk about it from their perspective. But I do want to share and bring Dr. Crenshaw to the room because she has been so central to developing thinking about this. And this is just one of her many, many quotes. And if you don't know her work, please look her up and start reading about it. She says that intersectionality is a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves and create obstacles that often are not understood among conventional ways of thinking. So you can see there's a lot there, but I'll go through key things, I think, and then I'll pass it on to our panelists to comment. So it's a metaphor, right? To understand the ways that multiple forms of inequality and disadvantage, or sometimes oppression, compound themselves, right? Combine, compound, pile on each other, and create obstacles. So we're talking about what are the obstacles of survivors, of people who cause harm, of families, that often are not understood among conventional ways of thinking, the way that we usually think about these issues. So I'll close my mouth now, and we'll ask Kalei to comment about this. I think you know Dr. Crenshaw yourself, right, Kalei? So I appreciate your perspective on this.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Can folks hear me all right? Okay, good. Good morning, everyone. It's a little early. I'm coming to you from not the snowy mountaintops of the island of Hawaii, but from Seattle, Washington, and it's still a little dark here. But I'm so happy and just really honored to be part of this gathering. So, I'll just comment on a few thoughts about the quote, actually, because it is kind of hard to even even a book to describe this really amazing, very simple but very elegant and very complex way of thinking. So a couple things I want to react to. One is I think the word intersectionality might be a metaphor, but I think of intersectionality as an analytic tool. So for me, I think about intersectionality as a way of thinking about and acting upon this notion of, and as it's described here, this compounding of various forms of inequality. And I would say it's really about social oppression, structural and social oppression. And so two things that help me think about intersectionality is the idea of an intersection in a traffic stop. And that is why I think Kim Crenshaw came up with this, which is the intersection is, for example, there are cars or people going in on one, let's say, and that one street is race. And then another street is coming across it at an intersection, and that could be gender. And so at the point of the intersection of these two, but there could be 3, 5, 6, it could be a roundabout. What you see is at this center, at this crux, at this nexus, is something that is very, very unusual. And that is that you see the ways that various forms of social and structural oppression intersect to create the conditions under which we understand how oppression, how discrimination, how disparities work. So two things I always think about is it's not this hierarchy of oppressions, that some identities and some forms of oppression are worse than others, but each of these intersections of different forms of structural discrimination, oppression, isms, each of them are quite unique, and they form at that nexus something quite unique, but it is a unique compounding of various forms of oppression. And I think, in the field of actually gender-based violence, but this applies to everything in society, actually, everything in society. But in terms of our work, I think of it as a way of thinking that everything that we do to try to address gender violence is this notion of the unique intersection and nexus that comes together that creates the conditions under which violence happens in intimate relationships. So I just love intersectionality because you know what? It's about my life, right? And so when I think of who I am, I'm not just one thing, I'm many things. I'm many identities. I have many statuses, and I'm a living and breathing exemplar of intersectionality, as is each and every one of us. So that's what I'll say. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's super helpful, Kalei. And I'd like to pass it on to Gretta. And Gretta, you can comment on the quote, of course, please do. And in particular, I think Kalei had said in a previous conversation, not right now, that this concept was originated to talk about the experience of Black and African American women. And of course, you work with survivors who identify in many ways, but that's one of the ways. So maybe you can add that perspective to the conversation, please.
Sure, and I am an African American woman, so that helps too. So thank you to CJI, to the staff who put this all together, to Juan Carlos for being a wonderful moderator, and to my panelists who I love, adore, and have followed for years. Yeah, I love that analysis that Kalei gave, and so I want to just kind of add to that analogy to answer your question, Juan Carlos, that the part that says obstacles that often are not understood among conventional ways of thinking. My response to that is I think that they are understood, and they are intentional barriers to perpetuate the structures that we have in place that prohibit some people from having access to resources, to wealth, to health, to safety, because there is a group, a population, or whomever who benefits from it, right? And so what I love about Professor Crenshaw's statement and Kalei's analysis is that when we are at the crossroads, there are those of us who pay attention to the railroad sign and the stoplight and the stop sign and who's in the next car, what's in my rear view mirror. And there's some of us who will just blow right through all of that. All of that has nothing to do with me because I am trying to get to the other side. And I think that that's what we're experiencing is that, when you're driving through intersections, you have to pay attention to multiple things at the same time. And when we don't do that, there are consequences. And there can be accidents, and there can be fatalities, and there can be all sorts of things, as you can imagine. I don't have to go into great detail. But what I think is so important for our work and for APIPS is to understand what we do understand and what we don't understand. And it behooves us to educate ourselves, to broaden our horizons, to increase those that we either socialize with, befriend, work with, so that we can, as Rebecca said, push out those growing edges. Because I think the whole sum and substance of this is if we don't look into those complexities, if we don't pay attention, if we don't broaden our minds and our experiences, the consequences are very severe. And it's not just for one population, it will be for all of us.
Thank you so much, Greta, for that. And it seems like we have a driving analogy going here. Let's see if Kat continues with.
I was just thinking about how am I going to do that?
Yeah, really. You don't have to do that, Kat. But Kat, you bring such an important perspective. I mean, many important perspectives. But I've been your colleague for many years, and particularly talking about our heteronormative model, right, in domestic violence and in abusive partner intervention. So tell us more about how intersectionality plays on that, or whatever else you want to talk about.
I'm not sure I'm going to get as many analogies as my colleagues did so beautifully, but I will try. And I think I just wanted to say also, just delighted to be here among these really, really wonderful people, and big thanks to CJI and the gender justice team there for putting this together. One of the things I get to do in my life that is the most meaningful is I co-chair a coalition called Hearts with Jean Johnson from CJI. And Hearts is an organization that was formerly Coalition on Working with Abusive Partners. We have transformed ourselves and are moving forward with curiosity and humility. And Hearts stands for healing, equity, accountability, restoration, transformation, safety. And it is a group that focuses on ending violence through intervention with people who have caused harm through intimate partner violence. And it is my deepest held belief that a focus on a true focus on intersectionality, not in a way that I think, speaking as a white cisgender woman who was sort of raised in the battered women's movement, I think that intersectionality has been watered down from how Dr. Crenshaw initially conveyed it, which was to really highlight the multiple jeopardies, much like the Combahee River Collective did for Black women around intimate partner violence, around social oppression, economic justice issues. And so when we're thinking about intimate partner violence, and we can't let go of anything that Kalei and Gretta have spoken about when we then add the layer of sexual orientation and gender identity. So it's not instead of looking at someone's race or ethnicity or class, it is in addition to, because the way that Kalei talked about the compounding of risk and vulnerability really comes up here. So one of the things that we know is that LGBTQ plus folks experience intimate partner violence at the same or higher rates as cisgender heterosexual people. And yet most of the images you all see, if you can think about the last several PSAs you saw or articles you read or conversations you were in about intimate partner violence, very often we shortcut that to violence against women. And the implication is violence by cisgender heterosexual men against their cisgender heterosexual women partners. And as Gretta said so beautifully, when we limit our ways of thinking, when we do not lean into the complexity of the ways that dynamics of structural oppression and identity and experience intersect to create risk and to block access to resources, it's very dangerous. And so we also know that transgender people, queer and trans people of color, non-binary people of color, and gay and bisexual men of color face particularly high fatality rates when we're talking about intimate partner violence, because they are generally barred or face more obstacles to accessing services and support due to structural bias and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So I think intersectionality is essential because it is not only for us to think about sexual orientation and not change our models and just make everything gender neutral. It's about actually understanding what are the unique experiences of people when you layer their identities and understand the intersectional obstacles, barriers, and pressures that they're experiencing and facing.
Thanks so much for that, Kat. And you know, other folks can jump in anytime. I don't have to ask you a question, you know that. And Greta, you talked a little bit about that, maybe this quote from Dr. Crenshaw that I don't know when it was from, maybe 30 years ago, that maybe now we should all understand this. I don't know, that's not what you said, but that many people do understand and still don't act on it, right? And so what do you mentioned obviously privilege and benefiting from it. Do you see any other barriers of why the field at large, and I don't mean only AP, but the movement, the field of, you know, gender-based violence, why haven't we embraced this concept?
Oh, loaded question, eh, Juan Carlos? Well, I think like anything, there are no absolutes. There is not one reason. I think the one of the reasons that resonates to the top is money. I think that once the movement was funded, it did become a prioritization of the movement of how can we serve the most with this new money. And how do we orchestrate the resources and services in a way that is more comprehensive and less tailored? And so when you do that, you tend to cookie cutter things, right? Like the one size fits all, because that's way we will serve everyone. And I think there's also this kind of language play of that we treat everyone the same, and that's equity, when in fact that is not equity. And it has drilled down to those with the squeaky wheel get the grease, those with really fabulous grant writers get the grant money, those who have the sexy packaging get the corporate funding, and we're going to serve everyone the same way. And so what happens is that when those people who have certain needs or cultural ethnic practices and or requirement, those fall to the wayside because it doesn't fit into, we serve everyone the same way. And you're asking for special treatment, and you should prioritize your safety over your need to pray at the certain time, or you should prioritize your safety over needing your own bathroom, or you should prioritize your safety over, you know, bringing your teen boy with you who we do not serve, and he can go someplace else. And if that doesn't meet your needs, then you can go someplace else too. So I think it's also a little bit of tone deafness, of hearing the needs of survivors when they come from complex identities, that there's an expectation of acculturation and mainstreaming because it's easier for the service provider. And we've seen this in many industries, not just ours. I mean, the healthcare industry and, you know, the legal community, you know, we want people to be compliant and fit into our schedules and fit into our concepts of what a victim or a survivor is like, because it's easier. So I think that's enough. I'll let my colleagues fill in where I may have missed.
Well, so I'm going to be explicit, benefiting from my long view. You know, now I get to say I'm old. I know some different things than I used to know, even, you know, 20 years ago. But, you know, 50 years ago when I started in this movement, there were no shelters, there were no laws, there were no programs. No, I mean, we kind of were inventing things, right? So what I would say, the main barrier to intersectionality is that we still live with the vestiges of white feminist privilege. That's what I think the problem is, because in many ways, the way this movement started is those of us who are brown and at the intersection of being brown, Black, and queer and Native, right? We were marginalized in the creation of and in the activism around this issue of violence against women. And this began with the rape and sexual assault movement, and then transitioning into domestic violence. And so, you know, I think many of the models and the ways we do things, which are over 50 years old, I would say more like 60 or 70 years old, if we think about the rape crisis movement, we're really kind of grounded in middle class, white, feminist, I'd say East Coast, no offense, East Coasters, but a particular way of white feminist creation. It was a particular social construction of the problem as through the view of white feminism. And so, you know, we still live with that right now. And so the fact that we spend billions of dollars on shelters when nobody wants to go to shelters, we still spend a lot of money on group programs that are kind of codified to address those who harm. This is all a vestige of, you know, between 40 and 50 years of the same old thing. And to me, this is about racism. It's about racism in the movement and racism in our service provision and racism in our analysis. And I think what I agree with Gretta about is it's much easier to think it's just a problem of cisgender people, white people, than it is it's too complicated, right? As Gretta said, it's too complex. You know, we don't do well when you have too many things that seem to us to be competing instead of complementary, right? So you can't think white. I mean, you can't think white and poor and immigrant and deaf or hard of hearing. You can only think of like a few things at a time. So it's a little bit of this simplistic way, and it's how our minds work and our hearts too, right? It's better to see just a few things. Too complicated to see too many things. And intersectionality has a promise of complicating our lives, and we don't like that. So.
Thanks, Kalei.
Just want to echo here. I think, and I'll just add to the mix that I think, as someone who was raised in sort of second wave white feminism, recognizing the way that also has become carceral feminism, right? And so recognizing that part of that monolithic view of what this was also led us to rely on carceral systems as the solution to violence that disproportionately negatively impact survivors and people who cause harm, who are folks of color, who are queer, who are trans, right? And who are Native, who are living with disabilities, right? And so recognizing that the harms ripple as well, and that we just have to start giving into the complexity and understanding that, you know, it is easier. So I'm in a lot of rooms where folks are like, okay, well, I can look at race, but I don't want to think about men, right? Or, okay, I'll think about men, but I can't also think about race, right? So, and I'm saying gender is not binary, and there's a whole panel that you can attend today, I'm all confused. I'm on too many panels, but it's going to be great. It's going to be great. I'm beyond the binary, but we have this binary of that I think white supremacy breeds very structured thinking that does not allow complexity, and it preserves itself. And so it took a long time for me to recognize, as a white woman who's been doing anti-violence work, not quite as long as Kalei, but close, 40 years, the ways in which, when I was running shelters, when I have been running programs, I've done harm by having this very narrow tunnel vision that is based in my understanding of the issues, as opposed to really listening and opening my ears to survivors who may be saying things that don't match my experience as a survivor. And so if we're truly, and I think most people in this room, in this conference, want to be led by the people who are most impacted, right? Those of us who are in survivor services and working with people who cause harm, we want to be survivor led in that. We really want to center the people most impacted. But that means we have to center folks of color, folks not on the gender binary, folks who are more impacted by both the violence that we're talking about in our intimate partner experiences and also structural oppression. So I think forcing ourselves to do that complexity is really important. And for those of us in the movement who are white, to really be conscious of the work we have to do. Sorry, my Alexa decided to talk as I was talking. I apologize.
Does Alexa have an opinion about this, Kat?
She has opinions about everything.
Well, wow, very, very powerful. And I heard all of you talking about that sometimes we think that we're survivor-centered, but the question is which survivors, right? You know, we talk about the perfect survivor. It usually is the white survivor that doesn't cause problems, or. But I like to move us a little bit. You know, I'll give you my opinion of how I see, and I realize I'm a newcomer to this field. I'm only been here for 30-something years. Compare with some of you. So, but I think that people who directly work with survivors and some coalitions, Washington being one of them, really in the last few years have been paying more attention to these issues. And of course, there's always been activists of color talking about them. My assessment is that APIPs or BIPs, I probably can count them with 1.5 hands, maybe. The ones that I would say that really are wanting to understand this, going back to this language. So I would like to hear from you folks, particularly with APIPs. What do you think is the issue, and what are the consequences? And maybe eventually we can move to some of the possible solutions to this.
Yeah, I could go. When I was chair of the CCR in Austin, Texas, one of the things I identified going to use that word twice, but was the batterer intervention programs kind of had an identity crisis. They didn't really know what their role was. Like, am I here to participate in punishment? Am I here to just warehouse and monitor? Or am I here to really rehabilitate and be participatory in the safety of the survivor and the community? And we had so many programs that were doing their own thing that it just, there was no synergy, there was no connection to the larger coordinated community response. They were just kind of the off to the side, we'll use you as we see fit. And that was unfair. And I think that it also became this intervention by the defense bar of how can we short circuit this process? And they were telling clients, don't say anything, just go, and then I'll be able to get you off of your charges because I'll tell the judge that you went to this BIP. And then some BIPs were like, oh, well, we're getting money for this. And then they massaged their curricula so that defendants or people who are participating in the program didn't have to actually admit to or to talk about their violence. And it just fell apart. And so one of the first things that we had to do is, what is your role? Why are you doing this? It is not to make money. You will never make money off of doing a BIP. So knowing that is not a money-making venture, what is your role? How do you want to participate? How do you want to show up in this? And you are going to have to change. You are going to have to change with regard to having groups, having, we're not going to allow you to medicalize the violence, that we want you to look at scholarly journals and read about what are the new trends. I think at the time, so this must have been mid 2000s, what is that? Like 2014, 2013, we were finding out that the old school of thought was you should do substance abuse, then BIP. But then there was some scholarly thought that if the person was still with the survivor, still in relationship, that they should do both at the same time. That you didn't have to, do just the substance abuse first, that you could actually do them at the same time. But if the two were apart, then you could stack them and do them one after the other. And so that was the thing too, is that nobody was holding them accountable. We're trying to hold, people who use violence accountable, but nobody was holding, BIPs accountable. So I think that we have to figure out together and not in isolation is what really is the role. Do we really believe in rehabilitation? Do we really believe in restoration? Do we really believe that the violence perpetrated in relationships really has to do with, in cisgender relationships, their morals and values around women? And then if that's what we believe, what do we believe the driving forces are in LGBTQ relationships? And is that taking on some of this privilege and supremacy and oppression and, those tools and applying them in same-sex relationships? And then how do we address that? Because that's very different. And I'll end with this. I think that the overbroad statutes in states actually complicate matters even more. When you have an overbroad family violence statute and then you summarily have to go to a batterer intervention program, that is not applicable to sibling violence. That is not applicable to adult child parent violence. And so really making sure that states have a domestic violence, intimate partner violence, however you want to characterize it, where there is relationship between romantic partners, that violence is very different. And family violence statutes have really done a disservice to helping BIPs and APIPs identify their role.
So, I want to thank Gretta because I'll go back to our traffic intersection metaphor, but, Gretta, again, is kind of paving the road towards that intersection for me, because what I think the challenge has been that Gretta describes so beautifully is that, again, going back to the roots of this movement and our work, we kind of didn't really care what was happening to those who were causing harm. Our focus was really solely 100% on survivors. I literally remember being at meetings when we were thinking about, starting new shelters or police response or whatever it was, that our main concern was, we kind of don't care about them. And so that combination of our moving so quickly into a carceral model, which is if we're going to think so there was a marginalization of those who harm, and our focus, and still I think, it's very hard for folks to focus on those who harm because we see them, and Donalene Lesky has done a beautiful analysis about the social construction of not only the problem of intimate violence, but how it is that we socially construct those who have been harmed and those who harm. And we have a way of marginalizing, neglecting, trying to make invisible those who harm because we think of them as evil. We think of them as bad. We think of them as criminals, right? And so the buildup of the carceral system and the way we address the issue of accountability for those who harm is in a carceral criminalized and criminalization modality, right? And so there's no other way to think about those who harm except that they're criminals, right? We even use the word offender, perpetrator. These are legal terms, right? And so what I think the problem and the challenge for those of us who care about those who harm, and I really mean this, that we care about and we value and we want to help heal those who harm, is that the carceral system is in complete opposition to the notion of healing. It's not possible to heal somebody that we think of as a criminal. And until we kind of remove the carceral system from the way that we're thinking about healing and ending and making free those who are suffering under domestic violence, it's going to always be a struggle for those who are trying to address those who harm. And the other part of it too is again, if we look at the roots of our movement, it's not only marginalizing those who harm from any care or anything we want to do, but it's also putting a disparate amount of funds and support and legislation into those who have been harmed, right? So we're not thinking of this as a relationship. We're thinking about this as two people, and it's still the two people kind of thing. And it's not a problem of our community. It's not a problem of our families. It's not a problem of making people well. And this is where intersectionality offers us the promise of this being more than just a crime, but it's really an issue and a concern about healing and wellness and care in our community. So if we think about our community as vibrant sources of wellness, then we kind of wouldn't be doing the kind of things we're doing. And I think the place where it's really suffering is in the service provision and legislation and statute and funding to help those who have harmed.
Yeah, and I'm going to just add, brilliant, both of you. I think also just to go back to the idea that carceral focus really goes back to our insistence on binaries that are really defined through white supremacy and cis heteropatriarchy. It says you are either a man or a woman, you are either an abuser or a victim, right? Or a survivor. And we understand, I think we understand more than that now. There is no perfect victim, right? And that does not mean that I am a survivor and have worked with survivors for decades. I would never say that I place the responsibility on the survivor for the violence. That's not the point. We can hold an understanding of power and control dynamics in the context of structural oppression and think about what's possible in terms of shifting the patterns and thinking about what allows that violence to continue. Any survivor advocate would say, listen to the survivor. Well, it's not the survivor's fault that violence continues. How are we going to fix the conditions that allow that to happen? And part of that benefits us in the movement, as both of my colleagues have said so clearly. And I think the other piece of this is, when we think about, I think about Mimi Kim, who I know Kalei knows well, and her work on transformative justice approaches to intimate partner violence. And I think back to Hearts was formerly Co-op, and before that, Co-op was called the Batterers Intervention Task Force in New York City, which was a secret organization. You could not admit that you were part of this organization because you would be ostracized by your colleagues in the movement for being a batterer hugger. That's where we come from, folks. That was, I believed at one time in my life, these people can't be reformed. So these people are us, right? We're all capable of harm. We understand that we live in a world that actually is conducive to harming each other and these structural forces that support that. So we really have to take many, many steps back and think about, if we're listening to survivors and we say we are, then why are we not listening to the survivors who say, please don't put that person in jail? That would be bad for me. But what we do is this maternalistic thing that comes from, I think, middle-class white feminism that says, you don't understand. You don't understand, you're not safe. And Greta, you mentioned choose your safety over this, but what I really feel like is so important for us to remember is safety is defined by us. I define my safety, right? And I know in New York City, when I was running shelters, which is some time ago, if someone was in a shelter, then the organizations that were helping them with some subsidies for housing would say, you can't live here or here because that wouldn't be safe for you. According to whom, right? According to some arithmetic and subway patterns. Whereas a survivor knows what safety is for them. And so we say we want to center the survivor, but we're not. And in APIPS, thinking about, when I've been engaged in programming that supports people who have caused harm in their relationship in queer and trans communities, I've been astonished at the ways in which folks come in and are willing to say, like, I was harmed over here and then I caused harm over here, and I want to understand how those things work together. I want to be a better partner. Are there people for whom that sort of programming won't work? Sure, because it's not a one size fits all, right? But there are so many people, and I think that we also have historically defined APIPS exclusively the criminal legal system, exclusively through mandatory programming that you have to pay for, which is all a construct of punishment and the assumption that nobody would voluntarily go. And therefore, folks who do want to voluntarily engage in programs to be a better partner, to learn how to have healthy relationships, there's nowhere for them to go. So I think we really need to think about making more options that have restorative and transformative justice principles that provide safety for survivors and never require a survivor to engage in a process they don't want to engage in, but find other ways of helping someone see the impact of their actions and heal from the harm that they also have experienced. Because we all have caused harm and we've all experienced harm. And of course, there are degrees, but thinking about those things in less binary terms, I think, helps us.
Juan Carlos, may I piggyback off of something Catherine said as far as like the analysis, like an industry really doing the analysis around how they've caused harm and change. So I often attend the California Alliance of Child Support Enforcement Attorneys, and they invited me to be their keynote many, many years ago. And I talked about bias within systems and the impact. And this year, they had a wonderful conference about how they had conducted either a national or a statewide poll asking consumers, why don't you use us? And they wanted in particular to hear from Black women who were either using or not using the child support offices. And overwhelmingly, Black women said, we don't want to use it because you harm our men. We want the money, we want to be able to support our children, but the harm that you cause is so horrible, we will figure it out and we will not use you. So instead of the agency going defunct and saying, oh, well, they don't want us, we're just gonna, close our doors, they said, how do we change? And so they are instituting some very new practices. One is they acknowledged and apologized for taking people's licenses and realized that taking driver's licenses was coercive, it was harmful, and it only targeted Black and brown men. And consequently, they were not able to get employment. They were not able to pay child support. They were being incarcerated. And not only were those things happening, but bankruptcy courts were upset with the child support enforcement agencies because they created this groundswell of cases. They said, well, how do you expect them to work and pay their bills if they don't have transportation? So they are revamping the way that they do things. And one of the things that when they talked with women was, would you take a month of diapers instead of, $100? And they said, absolutely, we would do that. And so they're looking at in kind, like what works for you as a family so that we are not harming you. And I just thought it was brilliant. I literally had tears in my eyes about a system who realized that they were creating damage to not only that family, but generations to come by their practices that they thought were, compelling or coercive. And so I think that we have a lot to learn from them as far as what did it take for them to look at, we're not doing this right. And we want to hear from the people who are supposed to be using us and how can we change in a way that is positive and transformative, to use that word, to help the people we're supposed to help.
Wow.
Just one more thing. Can I just add
Yeah,
one
of
quick
course,
thing to
Kathy,
that? I
yes.
think, Greta, to your point, also, when I hear folks say, well, this isn't what our survivors are telling us, or this isn't what the folks on my program are saying, I want you to think about who you're missing, who's not coming to you because you don't have services that acknowledge their existence or their experiences. And so simply saying, well, our survivors all want to make police reports. Well, then survivors who don't want to make police reports aren't going to your organization because they think that you're going to make them make a police report, as an example, right? And so in APIPs, if you're like, we don't see LGBTQ people, we don't see women, well, that's because they don't think they're welcome or they're going to be accepted there. So just be aware that if you're not seeing LGBTQ people, if you're not seeing folks of color, then you're missing something. And it's incumbent upon you to reach out to get support to figure that out. For all of us, I'm including myself in that. So we, not
disabilities, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we have heard many structures that are invisible and physical disabilities, right?
If I can just add one thing to Kat's thought there, there's been some research, and I know that this is kind of a pushback to a carceral analysis, but there's been some pushback saying when you ask survivors what they want, they don't say restorative justice, and they don't ask for those kind of things. And alternatives, right? Alternatives to 911, arrest, prison, jail. And so I started saying, like, why? That's probably true. That research is true. But two things. One is, do you say, here's some options. If I offered you 911, someone to a family intervention, not sending your partner to prison. You see, but if you ask, what do you want? It's like, duh. And what is it? It's because we have created we've created a domestic violence industrial complex that does not include these alternatives to the carceral system. So you literally cannot dream. You cannot imagine. You have not that space in you to think there is an alternative. And so, of course, a lot of us say, well, I don't know that, aren't we only supposed to call 911? I mean, think about it, all of you out there. Would you ever think that, I'm going to go over to that house and find out what's happening, and I'm going to get all of our neighbors, we're all going to go over to that house? It's like, no, it's a lot easier to just call 911. That's not my job, right? And I think even those of us who do this work think that too. So we cannot imagine, we cannot dream of peace, and we cannot dream of something different because the carceral system is so all-encompassing, and the domestic violence industrial complex, it pays for us to think differently. All right. And so this is what I think, again, the promise of intersectionality is freedom, is that we can really expand the way that we think, we feel, we love, and that we work. And this is what it's going to take. It's going to take us to be very vulnerable, to dream again, and to really want freedom, because that's what this is about. It's about freedom for all of us, but definitely for those who are suffering from intimate and family violence.
Wow. This is absolutely amazing, and I hope you all see that you're getting a lot of love from participants. There you go, hearts and claps. Wow, there's so much in this, and I love this last thing that you said, Kalei, that we're in a box in some way, and it's interesting, and something that you also said, Kat, that we have not only creating these paradigms, but if we deviate from those paradigms, we are punished, right? In some way, it's like they act like a man box, but it's like act as a creative provider box. And and it's interesting that in New York City there's so much interesting work happening right now. I have to say that's not been the case historically, and in fact, there were some programs historically there that would not accept non-mandated people because they said that's not possible. So talk about not being able to see something beyond. And one of the things that I often mention is like, well, I directed and facilitated for 12 years a small program in Western Massachusetts where it started as a totally non-mandated program. I don't like to use the word voluntary because, as we know, nobody wakes up in the morning, oh, I'm going to veterans intervention. But it was, we learned how to engage people, and eventually they passed the guidelines in Massachusetts, and we needed to get certified, and we started accepting folks who were mandated by courts. But it was interesting because at least back then when I was there, we created this culture of change and of healing. You folks are using words like healing, transformation, and those are words that I hear much more. I'll just say it, people of color, BIPOC people using those words, not only now, but historically. And there have been these little pockets of programs around the US who very quietly and under the radar, for a good reason, have been doing this work of healing. So one of the things I'm excited, and thank you for that story that you shared, Greta, about the conference, which, it's pretty historically pretty oppressive system. I think we are at a place where we have the opportunity to really look at this again and get that out of that paradigm and start thinking in different ways. So I like to open it to where I know that we will talk at the end of the conference about what's next, but if you have to share some practices, some strategies, some change of paradigms about where we need to go with this, with intersectionality at the center, what would you like to see?
Well, I'll start with an example or a promise for freedom. And for the last 20 years or so, I started in about 2000 with a domestic violence service in rural Hawaii, in Hilo, Hawaii. We got a CDC grant to design and to pilot test a Hawaiian cultural intervention, group intervention. And it was it was a research project, but we compared both survivors, Native Hawaiian survivors who came for services, and Native Hawaiian men. This was really for cis heterosexual couples, but we had Hawaiian men who were mandated to batterer intervention in the same agency. And so you could actually be selected in or out to go to a standard Duluth style model intervention, or a Native Hawaiian cultural intervention that was brand new. So, it was so I would say I spent the first 20 years of my career working only with survivors, as we described, who cared about them. Mm-hmm. And then the second half of my career working primarily with those who harm. And it was something about working with my own men, those who looked like my brothers and my fathers and my uncles, that I just came to this place of knowing after all these years that we just couldn't keep doing things the way we were doing them in anything we were doing in this movement. So, the story that I want to tell is, one of the ways we thought about our Hawaiian intervention is that you have to be accountable to your community, to your ancestors, and to the generations ahead. You're not accountable to the judge. You're not accountable to your probation officer. And you're not doing this to prevent yourselves from going to jail. You're doing this to become a better person, a better man, a contributor to our Hawaiian community, to the building of our sovereignty as people. And I remember that, you know, at the beginning of all of you who probably do groups, at the beginning, it's like, you know, take off your baseball cap and, you know, I mean, how are you supposed to behave? And what we started with is, and it really was very organic. We said, you know, we know a lot of you don't want to be here. And we're going to start with asking you or telling you, your ancestors saw what you did. And what do you think your ancestors felt, thought, what kinds of emotions and thinking did your ancestors have? And literally within 2 weeks of starting with, let's all go around and we started with your ancestors saw what you did. And what we saw was visibly, organically, at some somatic core, the men we were working with, first of all, they either started to cry or they looked down. And we said, let's go around and everybody say, what did your ancestors see and feel when they saw what you did to your partner and your children and your family? They were disappointed. They were shocked. They were hurt. They were afraid of what this meant for my future and the future of my family. And, you know, it was that tearing off of the carceral and the white colonial armor that allowed our men to come back to what we want them to be, which is men who care and love and carry the values of our culture. And this notion of you're not accountable to the system, you're accountable to your ancestors. We all have ancestors, and we all are descendants of a place and a time, and I really believe this, that was more peaceful, that was less carceral, that was less controlled by the state, that was less controlled by white privilege. And so I call on all of us to go back to that place of caring for something that's bigger than us. And I have seen tremendous changes in programs that started thinking this way, that you're not accountable to a carceral state. You're accountable to yourself, your family, and all the generations ahead. So, you know, one of the things I always close with the men I've worked with, is I've said, you know, you don't do this so that your relationship with your partner is going to be better. You do this for all the children in the generations ahead who will not know you, but you will know that they are different and our community is different because of, and are more well because of what you did. You are doing this for them, not for you, not even for your partner, but for the generations ahead, because their world will be better if we can all live this way. So this has been a tremendous change for me in moving towards restoration, healing, transformation, because it's a way for us to get back to, again, our whole intersectional selves have been bypassed in the ways we've been doing things. And I know now that coming back to our full selves and our ancient selves is the pathway to the ending of this problem. I really believe this now.
Wow, thank you, Kalei. That's absolutely amazing. Does someone else want to follow that? Kalei?
I'll defer to Kat. I've been speaking a lot.
I was just thinking, I think we could leave it there unless there's more questions. I feel like I've got nothing to add to that. That was beautiful. And I feel really inspired and appreciate you all very much.
I have,
Mic drop there.
I know, right? And mic drop. So Kalei is speaks to the heart, right, of the work. And I thought that was beautiful. I was feverishly taking notes to take back to my team. So thank you for that. The more, I guess, concrete things that I would like to see with APIPs are build what's needed, not what you are following a grantor for or different funder for, or what you are sitting in your ivory tower thinking what is needed. I think surveys have value. I think talking to people has more value. go to where folks are, talk to survivors, talk to grandparents, talk to schools who have had, or McDonald's staff who have had to witness child exchanges, see what is really happening in your community. If you have a population of Black people who say, we want culturally specific classes, make it. If you have a group of biracial folks who are like, I'm treated like this and this, I'm treated like this, I don't know how to respond to the system who is now, holding my freedom in its hand, make it. I think one of the challenges that we're experiencing is that Black women are the fastest rising racial and ethnic population in the carceral system. And almost all of them, I don't have the statistics in my head right now, have some background with domestic violence, whether as children or as adult women.
Right.
So, how are we, identifying that when they come to us as those who have caused harm? How are we addressing them in these programs? I also really think, and I would love my colleagues' opinion on this, whether an APIP is, I don't know, what do they range, 8 weeks to 52 weeks now? Aftercare. I have heard from many who have gone through a program of like, what do I do now? Where do I go now? I'm not done yet. The court says I'm done, but to Kalei's point, like personally, I'm still growing. I still need help. So what do we offer them as a community? Because that's really important. Change is hard and change takes time. And I don't think 52 weeks is enough. And maybe it's not court mandated, but to your point, Kalei, like, what do your ancestors want to see you do now? How do you invest in yourself, and what support do you need to continue to do that and create it?
Thanks, Greta. I would just add that I think in order for that to happen, I appreciate, one of the things that OVW has done particularly well is fund culturally specific programs for survivors, right? And I think understanding that APIPs need funded aftercare in the same way that we struggled for years to say, I ran shelters for a long time, and the folks who did end up in shelter needed aftercare. They certainly weren't done when they were done with 3 months or 6 months or 8 months of shelter. And so we know this. We know that we need a community service web and network. And so it's about resourcing communities and community-based structures, right? So I run a community-based organization in Washington Heights, and we don't do anything without going to the community first, right? This organization has been rooted in this neighborhood for 30 years. And sometimes our neighbors are Columbia University, as well as our neighbors are the people next door, and some of them are the folks engaged in street economies and the kids who come in for services and their parents and their aunties and their godparents, right? And so we really need to move away from these, we're only going to resource traditional mainstream programs that do these things connected to carceral systems or have these very specific ways of approaching things. We need to actually fund community-based research. We need to fund, like when people start telling me, well, there's no evidence base that abusive partner intervention programs work. I'm like, right, well, then let's study some of them that are not the one thing that was studied 20 years ago, right? And there are a lot of people doing amazing work in this field. Many of them are in this room. So, I appreciate opportunities to come together. And I think we need funders to pay attention and fund this work, not instead of funding support for survivors who are in danger, right? But in addition, we need to fund communities to figure out what they need, because all violence is related to structural oppression and economic inequality and access, right? And so all of the things my fellow panelists have said. So I just wanted to say, I think that funders need to pay attention to this as well.
And that's controversial in and of itself within the movement too, right? And so I was going to, thank you, Kat, because, where the argument is the pie is only so big, right? And we keep slicing it up. And then we talk about having coordinated community response, but we don't want to share the money, right? And I think OVW did a really amazing thing years back. And when I was building the Supervised Visitation and Safe Exchange Center, in midstream of our grant, they said that those who were visiting their children no longer had to pay. That the sliding scale, they did away with that because they really felt that people who wanted to build relationships with their children shouldn't have to pay. And that paying was not necessarily equivalent to accountability. And I thought that that was a game changer. And I remember like it was yesterday, I happened to be at the house that day. And I was telling a new client, oh, you know, we're doing away with that. You no longer have to pay. And he said, you will never have a problem out of me. Thank you so much. And it was a really great example for our team to see the humanity in him, because I think they had kind of just labeled him as an abuser father, you know, problematic, whatever. And I saw when OVW made that change, our teams changed as well in how they treated people. And I thought it was a really beautiful thing.
Well, you know, in terms of what we can do, I mean, it really has to do with decolonizing and deconstructing our way of being and our way of thinking, right? So like, you know, when people say, you know, restorative justice, transformative justice, well, first of all, even, you know, understanding at a core and at a core sense of who we are, what those terms refer to, because I think still in people's hearts and minds, whether or not you say it, it's considered soft justice, right? So, you know, transformative restorative is like, that's that nicey thing. Really, that's going to stop somebody from, you know, pushing their partners out of the car. Well, you know, nothing works for everybody. But that's, I think, what our panel is trying to say. Nothing works for everybody. But one thing doesn't work for everybody either. And we've been doing the one thing for 50 years, I'm telling you. And we were part of, well, not maybe me personally, there were some of us who were saying, no, don't do that, please don't do that. But you know, we were silenced too. But the fact is, we've been doing the same thing for 50 years. So come on now, don't we owe it to ourselves and our communities to try something different? I think many of us who do this work and are really trying to change the trajectory of what we're doing are saying, we're not saying that restorative justice or even a cultural approach works for everybody, but we know for sure that what we're doing from a carceral standpoint is definitely not working for everybody. If anything, it's harming people, right? And so we have to be brave, but it's not about a method or a strategy or a program. It's about how we think and feel about this problem. And until we get away from the more retributive, punishment-based way of thinking about solving this problem, almost nothing is going to be, we cannot see the possibilities if we cannot decarceralize our minds and our hearts. So, you know, this is where I think, for example, everybody's afraid of that abolition word, right? But abolition is not what it isn't, it's what it is. Right. And you know, Angela Davis and Beth and Richie and many people are saying abolition is not what we're taking away, it's what we're building. We're building Black places in community where people can go and feel and heal, to grow their own food, to be in community together in safety, right? So when I think about the aftercare ideal, you know, one of the things, this is too long a story, but if people can write me if you want to know more. I've started, I live in Seattle, but I've been going back to Maui to help with the fire recovery there. And one of the things we're starting to do is to really try to incorporate land-based, trauma-informed, culturally relevant and appropriate practices, kind of all rolled into the intersection of the fullness, right, of who we are. And I think this model of, you know, and so it's not even aftercare. Like you can go to a program on this land and you can keep coming for the rest of your lives to that place. You don't have to go to an office. You go to that place, you bring your family, and there are people there who are going to care for you, care for your family, and remind you that we are in a violence-free space, right? In speech, in thought, and in action. And that's true in all of our communities. We have those spaces. They have been, you know, relegated to neglect, and they've been neglected. But I think, as you said, Kat, I mean, and you know, Gretta, all of our communities, all of our brown and Black communities, our immigrant communities are so vibrant, they're vital. We're trying to, and we are still sustaining who we are. But we have to remember that these places live, and they've lived for centuries, but we have relegated them to the margins and we're not resourcing them. I'd rather we resource, I know OVW folks are here, but I don't work for OVW, but I'll say this is my opinion. I think OVW needs to resource community gardens, parks, community centers, places where our communities can go to be full and to be well and to be supported. And that's aftercare. Aftercare is everyday living care in a place that's healing and vibrant, fun, and that we can be our full selves. And that's what I think we're trying to do in Hawaii, right? So we're going to do kind of a domestic violence and a disaster recovery intervention on a land. But it could be a community center, and your go-to group, but you can come there on the weekends, you can come there with your families, and you can come forever. And you can work the land so that again, the generations ahead will know that you created that space that wasn't there before for them. So you're creating a space of wellness for yourself and the time ahead, the generations ahead. So that's what I think we have to invest in communities. And it really is in relationship to healing and ending intimate violence and family violence. So I think that's where we should resource ourselves, is in our communities again.
Sounds like prevention to me.
Yes.
Indeed.
Wow. This is definitely my favorite kind of panel, and where I don't have to say a whole lot. You folks are amazing, and there's so much that you have said that is important. I love this concept of community aftercare and so on. One thing I do want to address is that I have experienced that when people hear about culturally specific approaches like what you were sharing, Kalei, they often kind of disassociate from that. They say, oh, well, that's Hawaii, that's an indigenous practice, but there's lessons to be learned, right? Even if you don't have the capacity, and I think it's important that we name that most abuse partner intervention programs don't have any funding whatsoever. Texas is one of the exceptions, but they do struggle, and the ones that hadn't stayed around. So I think, Greta, you said they are not a money-making venture. You find that pretty soon, and they are not a social service. This is a social change kind of thing, right? So I think it's so important, and that it's the concept from margins to center, right? I heard Becky Masaki talking about it. I'm sure it came from somewhere else, but this concept of from margins to center, paying attention to the people, going back to our intersectionality, the ones that have the most layers, and really listening to that. I think one of you said this, we all benefit to that, whether you're in the mainstream, whether you're white, we all benefit from that, whereas the opposite is not true, as we have seen, and Kalei has said for 50 years and so on. So, and same with, for instance, LGBTQ programs, right? So much to learn for people that deal with heterosexual people from that perspective. So we have about 15 minutes left. There are some questions, and Brittany was so kind to highlight some themes. So apparently there's some questions about this community-based work, and how do you go to the community? What are you asking? How do you resource the community? I know these are big questions, but I don't know if anyone would like to tackle that.
I mean, I can start. I can say that in the work I've done in LGBTQ communities, going to the community is about incorporating, I think, if you're a community-based organization, for instance, I was working for an anti-violence organization that does work around all types of violence. And so certainly intimate partner and sexual violence, and also hate violence, right? Random violence. And we did a series of listening sessions specifically with those we felt were the most impacted, so queer and trans people of color in New York City. And we spent about 18 months doing listening sessions in all 5 boroughs. We went to where people lived, worked, and spent time. We put word out in networks. We had folks speaking from those communities. We partnered with community-based organizations and elected officials in those specific places, worked in coalition with other organizations who were reaching particularly underserved, marginalized, whatever words you want to use, parts of our communities collaboratively. And then those of us in the organizations who were service providers tried to bring whatever resources we had. So AVP took on a survey specifically about employment discrimination because we had more infrastructure and we were able to do that, whereas other groups did different sorts of outreach. And we came together to say, if we're an anti-violence organization, we want to talk about how do we build community safety. And so we went into communities and said, what do you need to be safe? And the top answers were not orders of protection, we're not call the police, we're not abusive partner intervention. It was we need housing and jobs, right? And so recognizing the intersectionality as well. And now I'm deliberately diluting intersectionality as we've talked about it, but there are other types of intersections we have to pay attention to, because that structural oppression that makes folks more vulnerable to violence makes them also less able to access remunerative employment, right? For the same reasons, racism, transphobia, classism, anti-immigrant bias, right? That is structurally and institutionally supported. And so recognizing those things, and, you know, then we as AVP over then the following 7 or 8 years built programming in response to this ongoing dialogue, right? And listen and evaluating as we went, and listening to communities when they said, boy, you got that really wrong, and not being defensive about that, but going, oh, okay, let's see how we can fix that. So I think it's building relationships and not being defensive. I also saw a theme in the questions in the Q&A that I scanned about should survivors be in this work, and should survivors be consulted in this work? And I would say yes and yes, of course. And also that sometimes when we say we're survivor-led, we're being kind of monolithic about survivors. And if there's nothing else I know in this world, it's that survivors are not monolithic, and survivors know what they need, but what they need may not be what we think makes sense. And so we also we have to continue to understand the ways in which people who are experiencing intimate partner violence and reaching for safety, their needs intersect, and they are unique, and they will tell us what they need. But we don't want to create these one-size-fits-all interventions that, again, as Gretta said, is shaped by funding or popular opinion, or a particularly vocal person who we've served who says, no, it's only got to be this way. We just have to take out the only, since we want to increase options. We don't want to decrease options, right, for folks.
Yeah, I think, a lot of what we do in our training and technical assistance is exactly what Kat said: go where they are, do the relationship building. Don't schedule a meeting and say, we want you to come up, show up, this building 12 to 2. No, don't do that. But go to festivals, go to community block parties. People are still having them. Go to sports events, create an echo chamber, that we're here everywhere. We want to help. This is what we do, but this is also what we can do. But we want to hear, to Kat's point, what do you need to be safe? Because we're looking at, evolving as well to meet the needs. For, I would say, the Black community, some of the places that we say, to build relationships before the ask. Don't go with the expectation if you're going to have a conversation and then you're going to have this ask of what can we do to, make things better, safer. What do people who use violence need? Build the relation. Pretend you're dating, right? Like a healthy dating situation. Just put your best foot forward before you start making the asks. Go to salons. Relationships with barbershops. Our barbershops are just as important as our churches, and you will get a lot of information just by sitting and listening, and not necessarily being a facilitator of those conversations. Invest in the community, don't study the community. And so are you sponsoring a little league team? Are you, going to the basketball games or the cheering section? Are you giving out free hot dogs? Like, those kinds of things where it shows that you're not just there to get, which our community is very accustomed to. We're very accustomed to being studied. We're accustomed to when we have tragedy, the mic is right in front of our face, blasted on national news. How can you be a silent partner in actively helping us be safe? And that, again, is relationship. And do not overpromise and underdeliver, because that will cause the trust and the rapport that you have built to disintegrate very, very quickly. Be honest and truthful and transparent on what you can and cannot offer the communities.
Something to add, Kalei, in terms of community engagement? You talked about it some.
Yeah, the other thing that I think that Greta and Kat are mentioning in terms of who is community, right? So there's that too, right? And who are survivors and those who harmed them. And so, in the spirit of both transformative and restorative justice, which is to involve more than just, right? More than just, that we think about reaching out to not only the survivor and the person who harmed them, but those around them, right? The co-workers. So like one of the things that I saw the NIJ, I don't know, maybe it was OVW call for proposals around violence against women. But one of the things I would love to do is to actually go into prisons and interview those who have harmed, who have been incarcerated. Including those who are survivors who may have been defending themselves and or sick and tired of being sick and tired. But we don't know very much about those who have been now embedded in the carceral system and what they wanted and what they would have wanted and what they still want that's different than what the carceral system offers them. But the other thing is, I really want to talk to the other family members, and the people, the communities around those families and those couples and relationships that are suffering. And so, the grandfathers and of course the children, your co-workers, and the team that you're playing for, your clubs, right? And one of the things that I worked with Mimi Kim again, who's the founder of Creative Inventions, and in their story collecting project, she and I kind of went around. We just wherever we went, we would ask people, like, have you experienced this? What have you done? And the one thing we need to remember in terms of the complementariness and the resilience of those who are harming or being harmed is that everybody's doing stuff outside of the system, right? So before you call a hotline, before you go to a shelter, before you get a restraining order, before you get arrested, somebody knows. Somebody has seen, somebody has heard, somebody has been told, right? And we don't have a lot of data about why isn't that enough, right? Why is it we can observe and see something and we don't, we can do it for TSA, but we can't do it for our friends and neighbors? Come on now, right? See something, say something. And so I think, we need to know more about everybody around us who is observing, hearing about, experiencing the issue of intimate violence. And let's find out what they want too, right? And because there are a lot of ideas of things we can do because people are doing stuff, And so let's figure out, let's like really go step way outside of the box. And I think there are things that we all can learn.
That's amazing. Thank you, Kalei, and thank you, everybody. We are out of time. This has been an extraordinary conversation. I think it has set up the table for an amazing conference. I know all of us are coming back at the end of tomorrow to reflect on the conference and expand on of this concept. You can see all the love that you are getting there. One thing that we didn't get to, but I just briefly want to mention, is that the intersectionality is not only about oppression, but also about resilience. And the multiple identities that we all have are sources of resilience too. Maybe tomorrow we can expand on that. So yeah, I want to thank you, Kat, Greta, Kalei, for your wisdom, for your passion. It's inspiring to see folks after decades still like, yeah, like there's so much passion, so much fire. That's so inspired. Maybe there are some young people in this call that are like, wow, that's amazing.